October 25th, 1944. The dawn broke slowly over the Philippine Sea. It wasn't a violent sunrise, it was soft. Pink and orange streaks of light painted the eastern horizon, reflecting off the water like oil on a canvas. The ocean was calm, terrifyingly calm. There were no whitecaps, no rough waves, just a gentle, rhythmic swell that rocked the steel hull of the USS Johnston back and forth, like a cradle. The air was thick, heavy with the humidity of the tropics and the salt spray that coated everything in a fine, sticky film. It was 6:30 in the morning on the deck of the Johnston. The world felt peaceful, too peaceful. Sailors were leaning against the gunwales, clutching mugs of hot, black Navy coffee. They were rubbing the sleep from their eyes. They were talking about the things men talk about when they are thousands of miles from home and trying to forget where they are. They talked about the girls they left behind in Brooklyn, the burgers at the diner in Texas, the way the autumn leaves would be turning red back in Ohio right now. They felt safe, and they had every reason to believe they were. The USS Johnston was part of a task unit known as Taffy 3. Their mission was unglamorous. They were the babysitters, the rear guard. They were guarding a group of 6 small, slow escort carriers, ships that were essentially merchant hulls with a wooden flight deck slapped on top. These carriers were supporting the ground troops fighting in the mud of Leyte Gulf, miles away. The men on the Johnston believed the war was happening somewhere else. They believed the main Japanese fleet had been broken, shattered by the mighty American Third Fleet under Admiral Halsey. They believed Halsey's fast battleships and heavy cruisers were guarding the northern entrance to the Gulf, acting as an impenetrable shield. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that Admiral Halsey had taken the bait. Had chased a Japanese decoy force north, leaving the gate wide open. He had taken the heavy hitters, the battleships Iowa and New Jersey, and left Taffy 3 alone, naked, exposed, and they didn't know that just over the curvature of the earth, steaming toward them at 25 knots, was the Japanese center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. At 6:45 a.m., the illusion of safety was shattered forever. A lookout on the bridge of the Johnston, a young man with sharp eyes, squinted into the horizon. He saw something, not a ship, but a shape, a dark, jagged silhouette cutting through the morning mist like a knife. It didn't look like an American ship. It looked unfamiliar. It had a towering pagoda-style mast that reached up toward the clouds. He raised his binoculars. His heart skipped a beat, then another. Behind that first shape, there was another and another and another. The horizon was filling up with dark, steel monsters. "Ship ahoy!" he screamed. "Bearing 340 at first. The officers on the bridge thought it must be the American Third Fleet returning. It had to be. There were no Japanese ships left. Intelligence had promised them that, but then the horizon lit up. It wasn't the sun, it was a series of bright, violent, orange flashes like lightning without thunder. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and then the sound arrived, a low, rolling, guttural rumble that vibrated through the soles of the sailors' shoes and rattled the teeth in their skulls. It was the sound of heavy ordnance, the sound of apocalypse. Boom, boom, boom. Suddenly, the ocean around the American carriers erupted. Massive geysers of water shot 200 feet into the air. But this wasn't just sea water, it was a nightmare in technicolor. The water was green, it was yellow, it was red, it was purple. The sailors on the fantail of the Johnston froze. They stared at the colorful splashes in absolute horror. They knew what that meant. Every sailor in the Pacific knew what that meant. The Japanese Navy used dye-colored shells for their battleships. Each ship had a specific color so that the gunners could tell which splash belonged to them in the chaos of battle. Green meant the battleship Congo, yellow meant the Haruna, and then there was the sheer size of the splashes. These weren't from 5-inch guns. These weren't from 8-inch guns. These were from guns so big they could swallow a manhole. General quarters, all hands man your battle stations." The klaxon wailed throughout the ship, the alarm that screams death is coming. Admiral Clifton Sprague, the commander of Taffy 3, looked at his radar screen on the carrier Fancho Bay. The blips were everywhere. He was looking at 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, and leading them, like a god of war, was the monster. The Yamato. To understand the sheer terror of that moment, you have to understand the Yamato. It wasn't just a ship, it was a floating fortress. It displaced 72,000 tons. It was the heaviest, most heavily armored battleship ever built in the history of mankind. Its main batteries consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns. These guns fired armor-piercing shells that weighed 3,200 pounds each. That is the weight of a mid-sized sedan car. Think about that. A Toyota Corolla, made of solid steel and high explosives, flying through the air at supersonic speeds. If one of those shells hit a destroyer like the Johnston, it wouldn't just punch a hole, it wouldn't just start a fire, it would vaporize the ship. It would turn the steel into shrapnel and the crew into red mist. The sheer kinetic energy would snap the keel in half, and standing in the path of this Leviathan was the USS Johnston. Let's talk about the Johnston. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer. DD 557, the sailors called her a tin can. And they didn't say it with irony, they said it because it was true. The hull of the Johnston was made of steel plate only 3/8 of an inch thick. 3/8 of an inch. That is thinner than the smartphone you are holding in your hand right now. It had no armor belt. It had no torpedo protection system. It was built for one thing: speed. It was built to hunt submarines and shoot down planes. It was never, ever, designed to trade punches with a battleship. A heavy machine gun could punch right through the skin of the Johnston. A near miss from a battleship shell could buckle her plates. She weighed 2,100 tons. Yamato, 72,000 tons. Johnston, 2,000 tons. It wasn't a fight. It was a physics equation that ended in zero. But the Johnston had something the Yamato did not have. It had a weapon that couldn't be measured in caliber or tonnage. It had a weapon made of flesh, blood, and iron will. It had Commander Ernest E. Evans. Ernest Evans was not your typical polished Annapolis graduate. He was a rough-hewn man, barrel-chested, deep-voiced. He was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, and he carried the blood of warriors in his veins. He was half Cherokee and Creek Native American. He was a man who didn't know the meaning of the word retreat when he took command of the Johnston at her commissioning ceremony in Seattle. He didn't give a polite, political speech about duty and honor. He stood on the fantail, wind whipping his uniform, looked his young crew in the eye, and delivered a prophecy. He said, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off, but they never forgot those words, and on this quiet, terrifying October morning, those words were about to become a reality written in blood. On the bridge of the Johnston, Evans looked through his binoculars. He saw the pagoda masts of the Japanese battleships looming out of the mist like skyscrapers. He saw the flashes of their guns. He saw the desperate situation of the escort carriers behind him. The carriers were slow. Their top speed was 17 knots. The Japanese fleet was moving at 30. It was a simple math problem. In less than an hour, the Japanese would be in range to massacre the carriers. Thousands of American sailors would die. The invasion of the Philippines would be thrown into chaos. Admiral Sprague ordered the carriers to turn east, into the wind, to launch their planes. He ordered them to make smoke, thick, black, chemical smoke to hide them from the enemy gunners, and then he issued a desperate order to his destroyers, an order that no captain ever wants to hear. "Small boys, attack!" It was a suicide order. He was asking the tin cans to charge into the teeth of the enemy fleet, to throw themselves onto the grenades, to sacrifice their lives to buy time. Evans heard the order. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the other destroyers to form a battle line. He didn't wait for a coordinated plan. He knew that every second he waited. The Yamato was getting closer to the carriers. He turned to his helmsman, a young sailor whose hands were shaking on the wheel. He gave the order that would make him a legend. Left full rudder, all engines ahead flank. The crew on the bridge froze. They looked at the captain. Left full rudder meant turning away from the safety of the smoke screen. It meant turning directly toward the enemy, toward the Yamato, toward the Congo, toward certain death. "Sir," the officer of the deck asked, his voice cracking. "Are we attacking?" Evans adjusted his steel helmet on his head. He looked out at the monsters on the horizon. His eyes were calm, cold, ancient. "We are not just attacking, Lieutenant," Evans rumbled. "We are going to give them hell." The USS Johnston heeled over hard as the rudder bit into the water. The deck tilted at a sharp angle. Coffee cups slid off tables. Books fell from shelves. The engine room telegraph rang. Cling, cling, all ahead flank, deep in the bowels of the ship. The engineers opened the valves. Superheated steam rushed into the turbines. The propellers churned the water into white foam. The ship shuddered as it unleashed all 60,000 horsepower. Black smoke poured from the stacks, marking their position for every Japanese gunner to see. The little destroyer broke formation. It surged forward, alone, a single, tiny ship, charging a fleet of 23 Japanese warships. It was the maritime equivalent of a man running at a firing squad with a pocket knife. It was brave, it was insane, it was magnificent as the Johnston raced toward the enemy, closing the distance at 35 knots. The Japanese commanders on the bridges of their battleships watched in disbelief. They saw this lone American ship rushing toward them out of the smoke. They saw it weaving through the falling shells, dodging death by inches. They were confused. This must be a trap, they thought. No one is this stupid. No one is this brave. There must be a battleship behind him, or a submarine. They didn't know they were fighting the Johnston. They didn't know they were fighting a ghost ship led by a Cherokee warrior who had already accepted his death. Evans grabbed the intercom handset. His voice boomed throughout the ship. into the sweltering engine rooms, into the claustrophobic gun turrets, into the hearts of every 19-year-old sailor on board who was praying for his mother. "All hands to battle stations," Evans roared. "Prepare to attack major enemy surface units. Survival is not expected, but we will do our duty." Survival is not expected. The words hung in the stale air of the ship. The men looked at each other. They were scared. They were terrified. Their hands were shaking. Their knees were weak. But then, they looked at their captain. He wasn't hiding in the armored conning tower. He was standing on the open bridge, exposed to the shrapnel, exposed to the fire, defiant. And in that moment, the fear turned into something else. It turned into a cold, hard resolve. It turned into adrenaline and into rage. "If the old man says we fight," a gunner's mate whispered, "then we fight." The Johnston charged. The distance closed, 18,000 yards. The Japanese battleships opened fire with their secondary guns, 6-inch and 5-inch cannons. Shells splashed all around the Johnston, rocking the ship violently. Water sprayed over the bow, soaking the men on the deck. But Evans didn't flinch. He played a deadly game of chicken with the Japanese gunners. He ordered the ship to chase the splashes. He would steer toward the spot where the last shell had hit, gambling that the enemy gunners would correct their aim for the next shot and miss him. It worked. The Johnston danced through the rain of steel. She weaved, she bobbed, she refused to be hit. 16,000 yards, 14,000 yards, still too far. The Johnston's main weapons, her 5-inch guns, could barely scratch the paint of a heavy cruiser at this range. To do any real damage, to hurt them, they had to use their torpedoes. But the torpedoes had a range of only 10,000 yards. To get there, they would have to survive the most intense artillery barrage in naval history for another 4,000 yards. They had to drive a tin can down the throat of a dragon. "Stand by torpedoes," Evans yelled over the roar of the wind and the explosions. "Wait for my command." The torpedo officer, Lieutenant Jack Bechtel, stood by the tubes. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He looked at the Japanese cruisers getting bigger and bigger in his sights. They were massive, heavy cruisers like the Yamato, armed with 8-inch guns that could tear the Johnston in half with one hit. "Steady," Evans shouted. "Not yet, not yet." The Japanese shells were getting closer. The splashes were drenching the bridge. Shrapnel pinged off the steel hull like hail, but the Johnston didn't stop. It accelerated. It was a mad dash into the jaws of hell. 12,000 yards, 11,000 yards. And then, finally, at 10,000 yards, the tin can was ready to bite. Evans looked through his binoculars. He picked his target, the lead cruiser, the Yamato. "Fire! Fire!" Commander Evans shouted the command. It wasn't a scream of panic. It was a cold, calculated execution from the deck of the tiny USS Johnston. 10 torpedoes launched into the water. Whoosh, whoosh, one by one. They hit the sea with a heavy splash. Their propellers spun up, churning the water into white foam, and they began their deadly run toward the heavy cruiser Yamato. The Yamato was a monster. It was the flagship of the Japanese cruiser division. It weighed 14,000 tons. It was bristling with guns. It was leading the charge to destroy the helpless American carriers. And it had no idea, absolutely no idea, that a tiny American destroyer had just signed its death warrant. As soon as the torpedoes were away, Evans barked his next order. "Make smoke. Hard right rudder, get us out of here." The Johnston heeled over violently. The chemical smoke generators kicked in, pumping out thick, white, choking clouds of oil smoke. It swirled around the ship like a protective blanket. The little destroyer disappeared into its own fog, running for its life, but the torpedoes were still running for 60 agonizing seconds. There was nothing but the sound of the Johnston's engines screaming at maximum RPM, and the roar of Japanese shells landing in the water behind them. The crew on the fantail held their breath. They counted the seconds, 40, 50, 60. Had they missed? Had the gamble failed? And then a shockwave traveled through the water. It hit the hull of the Johnston like a hammer. Boom! A massive underwater explosion rocked the ocean. A geyser of water and steel shot hundreds of feet into the air. One of the Johnston's torpedoes had struck the Yamato right in the bow. The impact was devastating. The warhead detonated against the magazine. The entire front section of the Japanese cruiser, 40 feet of steel, was blown clean off. The massive ship, which had been racing forward at 30 knots, shuddered violently, plowed into the water, and came to a grinding, screeching halt. It was crippled. The flagship was burning. It was out of the fight. On the bridge of the Johnston, a cheer went up. Men were slapping each other on the back. They had done it. A tin can had just knocked out a heavy cruiser. It was impossible. It was a miracle. It was like a bicycle knocking out a tank. But the celebration lasted exactly 3 seconds, because now the Japanese were angry. They realized that this wasn't just a nuisance. This little ship was a threat. It had drawn blood. And the entire Japanese fleet, 4 battleships and 6 cruisers, turned their guns on the USS Johnston. The air around the destroyer suddenly turned into a wall of steel. It wasn't just the cruisers anymore. The battleships joined in. The Congo, the Haruna, and the Yamato, shells ranging from 6 inches to 14 inches rained down on the Johnston. It was like trying to dodge raindrops in a thunderstorm. The water around the ship boiled with explosions. Shrapnel pinged off the hull like hail on a tin roof. Evans steered the ship wildly, chasing the splashes, twisting and turning. He was dancing with death. He was playing a game of Russian roulette with 1,000 guns. But you can only dodge fate for so long. At 7:30 a.m., the luck ran out. A salvo of 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo slammed into the Johnston. Think about that. 14 inches. These weren't normal shells. These were armor-piercing rounds meant to sink other battleships. They weighed as much as a small car. They struck the Johnston with the kinetic energy of a freight train. But here is the irony. The Johnston's armor was so thin, so pathetic, that the shells didn't explode inside. Their fuses were set to detonate after penetrating thick armor. But there was no thick armor, so they punched right through. They punched through the thin steel skin of the port side, tore through the engine room like a hot knife through butter, smashed the steam turbines, severed the main power lines, and exited through the starboard side of the ship before they even detonated. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of metal screaming. The ship lurched to the side as if it had been kicked by a giant. Steam, superheated to 600 degrees, hissed from broken pipes, cooking anything it touched. The lights went out. The radar went dead. The ship's speed dropped from 30 knots to 17 seconds later before the crew could even recover. 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser hit the bridge. The bridge is the brain of the ship. It's where the captain stands. It's where the steering is controlled. The explosion turned the bridge into a slaughterhouse. Shrapnel flew everywhere like razor blades. The radar mast collapsed. The steering console was destroyed. Bodies were thrown across the deck. Commander Ernest Evans was standing on the open deck when the shells hit. The blast threw him against the bulkhead. He tried to stand up. The world was spinning. His ears were ringing. He looked down at his left hand. 2 of his fingers were gone, blown off. His hand was a mangled mess of bone and blood. His chest was riddled with shrapnel. His face was burned. His uniform was soaked in blood. The pain must have been blinding. Most men would have gone into shock. Most men would have curled up on the deck. Most men would have called for a medic. But Ernest Evans was not most men. He was a Cherokee warrior, and he was just getting started. He didn't call for a medic. He didn't scream. He wrapped a handkerchief around his mangled hand. He ignored the shrapnel in his chest. He stood up. He wiped the blood from his eyes, and he looked around at the chaos. The bridge was gone. The steering was dead. The ship was slowing down. The engines were cut to half power. The Johnston was a sitting duck in the middle of the Japanese fleet. But then, nature intervened. A sudden, violent rain squall moved across the water. A thick wall of rain and mist swallowed the Johnston, hiding it from the Japanese gunners. The shelling stopped for a few minutes. They were safe. The engineers in the belly of the ship worked like demons. They were standing in oil and scalding steam, trying to bypass the destroyed turbines. They managed to get one propeller turning. The ship had power again, not much, only 17 knots, but she could move. This was the moment. This was the chance to escape. The ship was crippled. The captain was wounded. They had fired all their torpedoes. They had knocked out a cruiser. They had done their duty. No one, absolutely no one. Blame them if they limped away into the fog and saved themselves. The Navy manual said, if a destroyer is out of torpedoes, retire and repair. Evans stood on the fantail, the rear of the ship. Since the bridge steering was destroyed, he had to steer the vessel manually. He was shouting orders down an open hatch to the men below who were pulling the rudder cables by hand. Left, right, amidships. He looked at the rain squall that was protecting them. He looked at the safety of the open ocean. Then, he looked back at the battle through the mist. He could see the American carriers. They were still under fire. The Japanese destroyers were moving in to finish them off. The other American destroyers, the Hole and the Heerman, were out there, fighting and dying to save the fleet. Evans made his choice. He didn't turn south towards safety. He turned north, back into the fight. The crew looked at him. They saw the blood dripping from his hand onto the deck. They saw the fire in his eyes. Captain. A sailor asked, his voice trembling. Where are we going? Evans didn't shout. He didn't make a speech. He simply said, we are going to draw fire. We are going to make them look at us, so they don't look at the carriers. The Johnston emerged from the rain squall like a ghost ship. It was smoking, it was listing, it was broken, but its guns were still working, and its heart was still beating. Evans ordered the gunnery officer to fire at anything that moved. Mr. Hagen, Evans shouted over the wind. Fire at that cruiser, fire at that destroyer, fire at the battleships. Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, looked at his target. It was the Haguro, a heavy cruiser 10 times their size. "Sir," Hagen said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "It's like shooting peas at a wall. Our shells just bounce off their armor." "I don't care," Evans roared. "Aim for the superstructure, aim for the bridge, blind them, annoy them, make them hate us." And so, the Johnston charged again. It was a sight that defied logic. A broken, burning destroyer, moving at half speed, attacking a fleet of battleships and cruisers. It was like a terrier attacking a pack of wolves. They fired hundreds of rounds. The crewmen were loading shells by hand, sweating, bleeding, screaming. 5-inch shells smashed into the Japanese superstructures, starting fires, killing crews, creating chaos. The Johnston was weaving in and out of the Japanese formation, forcing the enemy ships to turn to avoid colliding with this crazy American. For 30 minutes, the Johnston held them off. It took hit after hit. A shell hit the number 2 gun turret, killing everyone inside instantly. Another shell hit the ammo locker. The deck was on fire, but Evans kept steering. He was shouting orders through the open hatch, his voice cracking, his body failing, but his spirit unbroken. He was walking the ladder of the Japanese fleet, distracting them, confusing them, but the Japanese weren't going to let this continue. They had had enough. A squadron of Japanese destroyers, led by a light cruiser, turned toward the Johnston. They were moving in for the kill. They were going to circle the wounded wolf and tear it apart. Evans saw them coming. He knew he couldn't outrun them. He knew he couldn't outgun them. But he still had one card left to play, the bluff. He turned the Johnston directly toward the Japanese destroyers. He charged them head-on. He pretended he still had torpedoes. The Japanese commander panicked. He thought the crazy American was going to launch another torpedo attack. He ordered his ships to turn away. He broke off his attack on the carriers to dodge a threat that didn't even exist. Evans had bought the carriers another 10 minutes of life. He had bought them with his own blood. But the end was coming. The Johnston was surrounded. 5 Japanese ships were now pumping shells into her from point-blank range. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a firing squad, while Commander Evans and the USS Johnston were fighting for their lives, bleeding oil and steel into the Philippine Sea. They were not alone in the slaughterhouse. The battle had expanded. It had turned into a brawl. A bar fight in the middle of the ocean, high above the smoke and the rain squalls. Something equally insane was happening. The escort carriers, the baby flat tops that Evans was trying to protect, had launched every plane they had, Avengers, Wildcats, Hellcats. They were scrambling to get into the air before the Japanese shells tore their flight decks apart. But there was a problem, a massive, terrifying problem. These planes weren't armed for a naval battle against battleships. They were armed for ground support missions in Leyte to help the infantry. Some had small anti-personnel bombs meant for soldiers. Some had depth charges meant for submarines. Some had nothing but machine guns. And some, in the sheer panic of the launch, had taken off with nothing at all. No bombs, no bullets, just fuel. It didn't matter. The pilots launched anyway. They flew straight into the flak of the Japanese battleships. They didn't have armor-piercing bombs to sink a monster like the Yamato, so they improvised. They attacked the bridges. They attacked the gun turrets. They tried to blind the enemy. It was a swarm of angry bees attacking a bear. Pilots flew down the throats of the Japanese guns, firing .50 caliber machine guns at steel armor that was 2 feet thick. It was like throwing pebbles at a tank, but it worked. It distracted the Japanese gunners. It forced the massive battleships to turn and weave to avoid these buzzing flies. One American pilot, Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, made dry runs at the Japanese cruisers. He had no bombs left. He had used everything, but he didn't go home. He flew down at them, again and again, pretending to drop a torpedo, forcing the Japanese captains to turn their rudders hard to avoid a weapon that didn't even exist. He did this for 2 hours, until his fuel was almost gone. Another pilot, Ensign Bill Brooks, found himself flying over a Japanese heavy cruiser with no ammunition. He was so frustrated, so filled with rage at seeing his ships burning below, that he opened his cockpit canopy. He pulled out his service revolver, and he fired 6 shots at the cruiser below. Another pilot, having nothing left to throw, actually threw a glass Coke bottle out of his cockpit window at a Japanese bridge. He hoped it would hit an observer. He hoped it would distract them for 1 second. It was madness. It was desperation, but it was buying time. And in the water below, the Johnston was no longer the only tin can charging into the fire. 2 miles to the south, the flagship of the destroyer squadron, the USS Hull, was about to write its name in blood. The Hull's captain, Commander Leon Kimperger, had seen the Johnston charge. He had seen the smoke, and he made a decision that would seal the fate of every man on board. He didn't wait for orders from the admiral. He knew what had to be done. He ordered the hull to charge the battleships. Imagine this moment. The hull turned directly toward the battleship Congo. The Congo was a 30,000-ton Japanese battleship. It was a mountain of steel compared to the destroyer. As the hull closed the distance, she became the primary target for the entire Japanese fleet. The Japanese gunners couldn't believe their luck. Another American destroyer was committing suicide. At 14,000 yards, a massive 14-inch shell from the Congo struck the hull's mast. It took out the voice radio. It destroyed the radar. The ship was deaf and blind. She couldn't talk to the other ships. She couldn't ask for help. She was alone in a world of noise and fire. At 12,000 yards, a shell hit the bridge. It killed half the officers, but Commander Kimpridger was still alive. He stood amidst the wreckage, his uniform torn, shouting orders through a brass voice tube to the engine room. "Keep her coming," he yelled. "Get us closer, we need to fire the fish." At 9,000 yards, the hull launched her torpedoes, but this time, the Japanese were ready. The Congo turned sharply to port. The torpedoes missed by inches. The gamble had failed, and now, the hull had to pay the price. The Japanese fleet unleashed hell. The hull was hit by more than 40 heavy-caliber shells in 5 minutes. 40, think about the physics of that. A single 14-inch shell weighs as much as a small car. It hits with the kinetic energy of a freight train. The hull was being hit by these every few seconds. The shells tore the ship open. They smashed the engines. They blew the guns off their mounts. The ship listed heavily to port, the water rushing into her broken hull. Fires raged from bow to stern, and yet, she didn't sink, not yet. Her number 3 gun, jammed in manual control, kept firing. The crewmen were slipping in blood, loading shells by hand, firing at the massive battleships that loomed over them like skyscrapers. They fired until the barrels glowed red hot. They fired until the water washed over their ankles. They fired until a direct hit vaporized the turret. At 8:55 a.m., the USS Hull finally gave up the ghost. She rolled over and sank. Only 86 men survived out of a crew of 300, but the sacrifice wasn't over. The dance of death continued. While the Hull was dying, another small ship, the USS Herman, was doing something even crazier. The Herman, led by Commander Amos Hathaway, charged straight into the middle of the Japanese formation. It got so close to the enemy ships that the Japanese couldn't depress their guns low enough to hit her. It was a knife fight in a phone booth. The Herman was weaving between battleships, spraying them with 5-inch shells. At one point, she was fighting 4 Japanese battleships at the same time. The Haruna, the Congo, the Nagato, and the Yamato. It was the most chaotic moment of the battle. The smoke was so thick that ships were colliding. The noise was so loud that men's ears were bleeding. On the bridge of the Yamato, the Japanese Admiral Kurita was losing his mind. He couldn't see anything. His radar was confused by the American chaff. His lookouts were screaming about torpedoes in the water. He saw destroyers charging out of the smoke like demons. He saw planes buzzing his bridge. Kurita made a fatal mistake. He turned the Yamato away, the biggest battleship in the world, the pride of the Imperial Navy, turned its back and ran away from a couple of tin cans, the Herman. A ship 1/30th the size of the Yamato had forced the giant out of the battle for 10 crucial minutes. Those 10 minutes saved the American carriers. It was the turning point, but the cost was high. The Herman was riddled with holes, her bow was smashed, her anchors were dragging in the water, she was a floating wreck. But there was one more hero that day, the smallest of them all, the USS Samuel B. Roberts. The Sammy B wasn't even a destroyer, it was a destroyer escort. It was smaller, it was slower, it had only 2 guns, it was designed to protect convoys from submarines, not to fight surface actions, but her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was a man of immense dignity when the battle started. He got on the loudspeaker, he spoke to his crew, he didn't sugarcoat it, he didn't lie. "Men," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We are going into a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The Sammy B charged. She took on the heavy cruiser Choctaw, a ship 10 times her size. The Sammy B fired so fast and so furiously that she fired 600 shells in an hour. That is 1 shell every 6 seconds. She fired so many rounds that she ran out of ammunition, but the crew didn't stop. They went to the storage lockers. They grabbed star shells, illumination rounds, practice rounds. They fired anything that would fit in the breech. They fired so fast that the paint on the gun barrels caught fire and peeled off. The grease in the breech block boiled. The Sammy B fought like a battleship. She blew the bridge off the chalk. She set her on fire. But then, the inevitable happened. 3 14-inch shells from the Battleship Congo struck the Sammy B. They tore her open like a sardine can. The little ship shuddered and stopped. As the crew abandoned ship, one gunner's mate, Paul H. Carr, was found in the number 2 gun turret. He was dying. His stomach had been torn open by shrapnel, but he was still trying to load the last shell into the breech. He died with the shell in his arms, begging his shipmates to help him fire one last shot. The little ship that could slipped beneath the waves, but because of the Johnston, because of the Hole, because of the Heerman, and because of the Sammy B, the Japanese fleet was in chaos. Admiral Kurita was confused. He thought he was fighting the main American fleet. He thought the aggression of the Americans meant they had heavy backup just over the horizon. He hesitated, and while he hesitated, the USS Johnston was entering her final hour. Commander Evans was still on the fantail. He was bleeding. He was exhausted. He had watched his friends die. He had watched the Hole sink. He had watched the Sammy B burn, but he was still fighting. He saw a squadron of Japanese destroyers lining up for a final torpedo run on the American carriers. Those torpedoes hit. The carriers would sink. Evans didn't have any torpedoes left. He didn't have any speed left. He didn't have any radar, but he had a ship. And he had a will of iron. He pointed the broken bow of the Johnston at the Japanese destroyers. He ordered his gunners to fire at them. He charged them. He crossed the T of the Japanese formation. He forced them to turn away. He forced them to launch their torpedoes early, from too far away. The torpedoes missed the carriers. Evans had done it again. He had saved the fleet. But now, the Johnston was alone. The other destroyers were sunk or crippled. The smoke was clearing, and 5 Japanese ships were closing in to finish the job. They formed a semicircle of death around the limping Johnston. They moved in for the kill, 9:30 a.m. The battle had been raging for nearly 3 hours. To the men on the USS Johnston, it didn't feel like hours. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like they had been fighting since the beginning of time itself. The ship was no longer a fighting vessel. It was a floating wreck. It was a burning sieve of twisted steel and shattered glass. The bridge, the nerve center where Commander Evans had stood and defied an empire, was gone, blown away by a direct hit from a battleship shell. The mast was snapped in half like a dry twig during a hurricane. The decks were slippery with oil, hydraulic fluid, and the blood of brave men. Fires were burning out of control in the ammunition lockers, cooking off shells that exploded with terrifying randomness, shaking the hull like a dying animal. The heat was so intense that the paint on the bulkheads was blistering and peeling off. And yet, she was still fighting. The Johnston was now surrounded. 5 Japanese destroyers had moved in for the kill. They were circling her like wolves circling a wounded buffalo. They were pouring fire into her from point-blank range. They were so close that the American sailors could see the faces of the Japanese gunners. They could see the officers looking at them through binoculars, wondering why this stubborn little ship wouldn't just die. Every time a Japanese shell hit, the Johnston shuddered. Metal screamed as it was torn apart. But every time the smoke cleared, the Japanese saw something that made them pause. They saw something that defied all logic and reason. The Johnston was shooting back. Only one gun was left operational. The number 4 gun, on the rear of the ship. The electrical systems were dead. The radar aiming was dead. The hydraulics were dead. It was being operated by a man named Robert Hagen and a skeleton crew of sailors who refused to quit. They were loading the 40-pound shells by hand. They were aiming with their eyes, looking down the barrel like it was a giant rifle. They were slipping in the blood of their fallen comrades, but they kept firing. Fire, reload, fire, reload. Hagen was screaming orders over the roar of the battle. His voice was raw. His uniform was shredded, but he kept the guns singing. They hit a Japanese destroyer, then another. They were hitting the bridge of the enemy ships, smashing searchlights, destroying railings, forcing the Japanese captains to turn away to avoid the sting of this dying wasp. It was defiance in its purest form, a refusal to die quietly. It was the spirit of the American Navy condensed into a single-gun turret. But physics is cruel, and machines, no matter how brave their crews are, eventually break at 9:45 a.m. The Johnston's engines finally gave out. The last boiler lost pressure. The steam turbines spun down with a mournful whine. The propeller stopped turning. The hum of the machinery, which had been the heartbeat of the ship since she was launched, faded into a terrifying silence. The ship went dead in the water. She lost her momentum. She became a drifting target. Commander Ernest Evans, battered, bleeding, missing 2 fingers from his left hand, stood on the fantail. He felt the ship stop. He felt the life go out of her. He knew it was over. He had done everything a human being could do. He had charged the biggest fleet in the world. He had fought the Yamato. He had fought the Congo. He had saved the carriers. He had bought them time with the blood of his ship. He looked at his crew. The men were exhausted. Their faces were black with soot and oil. Their eyes were wide with the trauma of combat. They were looking at him, waiting for the final order. They would have fought to the last man if he had asked them to, but Evans knew that the fight was done. Now, his duty was to save what was left of his family. Evans straightened his back, despite his wounds, despite the pain that must have been tearing him apart. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a chief who had led his tribe to glory. "All hands," he said. His voice calm but loud enough to be heard over the crackling fires. "Abandon ship." It is the hardest order a captain can ever give. It is the admission that the ship is lost. The men began to jump. Some scrambled down the cargo nets that were draped over the side. Some just leaped into the oil-slicked water. They inflated their life vests. They grabbed onto pieces of floating debris, crates, shell casings, anything that would float. At 10:10 a.m., the USS Johnston rolled over. She groaned as the water rushed into her open wounds. She began to sink by the bow. The stern lifted into the air, pointing toward the sky as if in a final act of defiance against the gravity that was pulling her down. And then, something happened that has become a legend in naval history, something that proves that even in the hell of war, even in the midst of slaughter, there is room for honor. A Japanese destroyer, the Ukikaze, moved in slowly. It came closer and closer. It came so close to the sinking Johnston that the American sailors in the water thought they were going to be machine-gunned. They braced themselves for death. They huddled together, waiting for the bullets to tear into them, but the machine guns remained silent. Instead, the Japanese sailors lined the rail of their ship. They stood at attention. They weren't cheering. They weren't laughing at their defeated enemy. They were silent, and on the bridge of the Ukikaze, the Japanese captain stepped out. He was dressed in his pristine white uniform. He looked down at the sinking American ship. He looked at the men struggling in the oil, and then, slowly, solemnly, he raised his hand. He saluted. He was saluting the USS Johnston. He was saluting the tin can that had fought like a battleship. He was honoring the warrior spirit of an enemy who refused to surrender. He recognized that what he had just witnessed was not just a battle, but a display of ultimate courage. It was the ultimate sign of respect, the samurai bowing to the warrior. As the Ukikaze sailed away, the USS Johnston slipped beneath the waves. She went down to the bottom of the Philippine Sea, 4 miles deep. She took her scars, her guns, and her glory into the darkness, but the tragedy wasn't over. Commander Ernest Evans was last seen on the fantail. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was helping his men evacuate. He was making sure everyone got off. Some survivors said they saw him jump into the water with the last group. Others said he stayed with the ship, holding onto the rail as she went down. He was never seen again. He didn't make it onto the life rafts. The ocean, the element he had spent his life mastering, finally claimed him. He died as he had lived, fighting for his men, but for the survivors in the water. The battle was over. But the horror was just beginning. They watched the Japanese fleet sail away. They watched the smoke clear from the horizon. They were alone, floating in the vast, empty Pacific Ocean. They expected to be rescued immediately. The American fleet was nearby. They had radioed their position. They thought help would come in an hour, maybe 2. They cracked jokes. They helped the wounded onto the rafts. They waited, but hours turned into night. The sun went down, painting the sky in blood-red colors before fading into black. The water turned pitch black and cold, and then the sharks came, oceanic white-tip sharks. They are the scavengers of the open ocean. They are aggressive, they are persistent, and that night, they were hungry. They were drawn by the miles of blood that had been spilled into the water. The survivors of the USS Johnston were floating in a thick sludge of fuel oil. It coated their skin like tar. It burned their eyes. It filled their lungs every time a wave washed over them. But the oil did one good thing. It masked their scent. But it didn't mask the blood of the wounded. As the moon rose, the men couldn't see the sharks, but they could feel them. They could feel the rough sandpaper skin brushing against their legs in the darkness. They could hear the splashes as the predators circled, and then they heard the screams every 20 or 30 minutes. A sharp, piercing scream would shatter the silence of the night. Then a flurry of splashing, a desperate struggle, and then silence, one less man. The sailors huddled together in tight circles. They kicked their legs. They splashed the water. They punched the sharks on the nose with their bare fists. They fought with everything they had. They were exhausted. They were dehydrated. They were traumatized, but they refused to give up. "Stay together," the officers shouted. "Don't drift away. Kick, kick." They prayed for the sun to rise. They prayed for the Navy to come. "Hold on," the officers told the men. "The fleet knows where we are. They'll be here by morning. Just hold on until morning." But morning came, and the ocean was empty. The sun beat down on them like a hammer. The tropical heat was unbearable. Their lips cracked and bled. Their tongues swelled in their mouths. Dehydration does terrible things to the human mind. It breaks the barrier between reality and nightmare. Men started to hallucinate. One sailor swore he saw a grocery store floating on the horizon. "I'm going to get a Coke," he rasped to his friends. "Does anyone want a Coke?" He unclipped his life vest and started swimming toward the empty horizon. His friends tried to stop him, but the madness gave him strength. He swam 50 yards, and then sank. He never came back. Another group of sailors believed they were still on the ship. They stood in the water, forming a line, treading water, waiting for the mess hall to open for breakfast. They argued about who was cutting in line. They stood there, dying of thirst, waiting for food that didn't exist. They didn't know the truth. The Navy had made a mistake due to a confusion in communications. The rescue ships thought the survivors had already been picked up. No one was coming. No one was even looking for them. They had been abandoned. They spent a second night in the water. More sharks, more screams, more silence. By the morning of the third day, many men had simply let go. They unclipped their life vests and slipped beneath the waves, finding peace in the deep. They just wanted the pain to stop. But then, a miracle, an American patrol plane, flying a routine reconnaissance mission, spotted an oil slick. The pilot circled back. He saw the tiny dots bobbing in the water. He saw the men waving their shirts. He radioed the position, and this time, the Navy listened. Within hours, American landing craft appeared on the horizon. The survivors wept. They cheered with dry, cracked throats. They were pulled from the water, covered in oil, looking like ghosts. Of the 327 men who sailed on the USS Johnston, only 141 survived. 186 men died, including Commander Ernest Evans, the captain who had charged a battleship, who had steered his ship with one hand while bleeding to death, was gone. He had given his life to save his men, and to save the fleet. When the survivors were brought aboard the rescue ships, they told their story, and the officers listening couldn't believe it. They talked about a single destroyer charging a fleet of 23 ships. They talked about a captain who fought like a demon. They talked about a crew that fired their guns until the water swallowed them. The legend of Taffy III and the USS Johnston began to spread. The Japanese admiral, Takeo Kurita, later admitted that he retreated because he was scared. He thought he was fighting a massive American task force. He thought the aggressive attacks by the Johnston were proof that he was facing heavy cruisers and battleships. The tin can had bluffed the giant, and won because of the Johnston and the other brave, small boys that fought that day. The Japanese center force never reached the defenseless American carriers. The invasion force at Leyte Gulf was saved. The battle off Samar goes down in history as the greatest mismatch in naval warfare. It was a battle that the Americans should have lost in 10 minutes. Instead, they won. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He became the first Native American sailor to receive the nation's highest award. His citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But perhaps the greatest tribute didn't come from a medal or a citation or a history book. It came from the enemy, years later. A Japanese officer who had been at the battle stood on the deck of his ship and recalled the moment he saw the Johnston sink. He said, "We had never seen anything like it. They charged us like demons. We had to destroy them, but we honored them. They were the bravest men we ever fought." But hours turned into night. The sun went down, painting the sky in blood-red colors before fading into black. The water turned pitch black and cold, and then the sharks came, oceanic white-tip sharks. They are the scavengers of the open ocean. They are aggressive, they are persistent, and that night, they were hungry. They were drawn by the miles of blood that had been spilled into the water. The survivors of the USS Johnston were floating in a thick sludge of fuel oil. It coated their skin like tar. It burned their eyes. It filled their lungs every time a wave washed over them. But the oil did one good thing. It masked their scent, but it didn't mask the blood of the wounded. As the moon rose, the men couldn't see the sharks, but they could feel them. They could feel the rough sandpaper skin brushing against their legs in the darkness. They could hear the splashes as the predators circled, and then they heard the screams every 20 or 30 minutes. A sharp, piercing scream would shatter the silence of the night. Then a flurry of splashing, a desperate struggle, and then silence, one less man. The sailors huddled together in tight circles. They kicked their legs. They splashed the water. They punched the sharks on the nose with their bare fists. They fought with everything they had. They were exhausted. They were dehydrated. They were traumatized, but they refused to give up. "Stay together," the officers shouted. "Don't drift away. Kick, kick." They prayed for the sun to rise. They prayed for the Navy to come. "Hold on," the officers told the men. "The fleet knows where we are. They'll be here by morning. Just hold on until morning." But morning came, and the ocean was empty. The sun beat down on them like a hammer. The tropical heat was unbearable. Their lips cracked and bled. Their tongues swelled in their mouths. Dehydration does terrible things to the human mind. It breaks the barrier between reality and nightmare. Men started to hallucinate. One sailor swore he saw a grocery store floating on the horizon. "I'm going to get a Coke," he rasped to his friends. "Does anyone want a Coke?" He unclipped his life vest and started swimming toward the empty horizon. His friends tried to stop him, but the madness gave him strength. Swam 50 yards, and then sank. He never came back. Another group of sailors believed they were still on the ship. They stood in the water, forming a line, treading water, waiting for the mess hall to open for breakfast. They argued about who was cutting in line. They stood there, dying of thirst, waiting for food that didn't exist. They didn't know the truth. The Navy had made a mistake due to a confusion in communications. The rescue ships thought the survivors had already been picked up. No one was coming. No one was even looking for them. They had been abandoned. They spent a second night in the water, more sharks, more screams, more silence. By the morning of the third day, many men had simply let go. They unclipped their life vests and slipped beneath the waves, finding peace in the deep. They just wanted the pain to stop. But then, a miracle, an American patrol plane, flying a routine reconnaissance mission, spotted an oil slick. The pilot circled back. He saw the tiny dots bobbing in the water. He saw the men waving their shirts. He radioed the position, and this time, the Navy listened. Within hours, American landing craft appeared on the horizon. The survivors wept. They cheered with dry, cracked throats. They were pulled from the water, covered in oil, looking like ghosts. Of the 327 men who sailed on the USS Johnston, only 141 survived. 186 men died, including Commander Ernest Evans, the captain who had charged a battleship, who had steered his ship with one hand while bleeding to death, was gone. He had given his life to save his men and to save the fleet. But the story didn't end there. For 75 years, the USS Johnston was gone. She had vanished from the surface of the earth. She existed only in the history books and in the nightmares of the few old sailors who had survived. The ocean kept its secrets. The Johnston lay hidden in the dark, waiting. But in 2021, a team of explorers led by Victor Vescovo decided to go back. They brought with them the DSV limiting factor, a titanium submersible designed to go to the bottom of the world. They weren't just looking for a shipwreck. They were going to the edge of hell. The Johnston wasn't just deep. She was sitting in the Emden Deep, over 21,000 feet below the surface. That is 4 miles down. It is deeper than the Titanic. The descent took 4 hours. Finally, at 21,000 feet, the sonar pinged. The pilot turned on the floodlights, and there she was, the USS Johnston. She was sitting upright, preserved by the freezing cold. The white paint of her hull number, 557, was still visible as the cameras moved closer. The explorers saw the guns. The number 1 gun turret was trained to starboard. The number 2 gun was pointed to port, even in death. Even after 75 years at the bottom of the world, the Johnston was still fighting. She was still aiming at the enemy. The story of Taffy 3 and the USS Johnston is a story about the human spirit. It teaches us that the size of the warrior doesn't matter. What matters is the size of the heart. The Johnston was a tin can, a lightweight, a disposable ship. But on that morning in October, she fought like a battleship. She faced the Yamato, the biggest monster on the ocean. And she made the giant blink. Commander Ernest Evans never came home. His body was never found, but his words, spoken on the day he took command, still ring true today. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." He kept his promise. He went into harm's way, and he never looked back. So, the next time you feel overwhelmed, the next time you feel like the odds are stacked against you and there is no way to win, think of the USS Johnston. Think of the tin can that charged a fleet. And remember, surrender is a choice, and it is a choice you don't have to make. If this incredible story of the USS Johnston moved you, please pay your respects by hitting that like button. It helps us keep the memory of these brave men alive. And I have a question for you in the comments. If you were in Commander Evans' shoes, commanding a tiny ship against the biggest fleet in the world, would you have attacked or would you have followed the orders to retreat? Let me know your honest answer below. We have more incredible stories of forgotten history coming soon. Make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss them. As always, thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.